morning, everybody, and welcome back to The Walk. Today is Tuesday, June 24th, and we have finally made it to Hebrews chapter 5. We're going to jump right in because there's a lot of content to cover today. So verse 1 says, "For every high priest chosen among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins." So in order to completely understand this chapter, you need to have some of that background knowledge from the Old Testament. You need to understand that there was a process in which high priests were chosen and that they were to act in relation to God. They were to be that go-between between the people and God. The catch was they had to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins for the people, but they couldn't effectively do that until they had done so for their own sin. And that's where Jesus is very different, because he didn't have to do that for his own sin. In the ESV Fire Study Bible, it gave us this information. 2 qualifications are necessary for a valid priesthood. The priest must be sympathetic, gentle, and patient with those who go astray spiritually through ignorance, unintentional sin, or weakness. He must be appointed by God. Christ is more than qualified in both ways. So not only was Christ sympathetic, gentle, and patient, he was also appointed by God. So he more than meets those qualifications. Verse 2, he can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. So this is setting us up for the difference between a high priest that had to atone for their own sin before they could atone for the other people's sin, and Christ. But Christ still dealt with us very gently. Christ still had those times of intense sorrow and intense breaking down. I'm thinking of the Garden of Gethsemane. So when they're chosen, when these high priests were chosen in the Old Testament and before Christ took over, as the ultimate high priest, they had to atone for their sin. And Christ can skip that step because there is no sin. So in the Cultural Study Bible, it said, like other high priests, Christ can sympathize with human weakness, but he is greater than they, since they must first atone for their own sin, whereas Christ did not sin. That brings us to verse 4, which says, "And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was." So all of these high priests, Christ included, were called by God. So the way to become a high priest was to be called by God. And they had responsibilities. They had to offer gifts and sacrifices. They had to deal gently with the people. They had to sacrifice for their own sin and then sacrifice for other sins. The Cultural Study Bible said the writer of Hebrews and his diaspora audience would think of the biblical high priest, not the political situation in Judea. There, Rome, or more recently, Agrippa II, installed and deposed high priest as they deemed fit. So as these Hebrews that this letter was written to would be reading this, they would think of the Old Testament high priest, not the high priests that were being chosen in Rome for political purposes and to increase the power of the leaders in Rome. So we've got to keep in mind that at this time, the choice of high priest could have been heavily influenced by politics. But these Hebrews that this letter was written to, they wouldn't have referred to that. They would have gone back all the way to this Old Testament high priest. Once again, you want to keep in mind the differences. The Old Testament high priest had to atone for their sin first, then atone for the sin of the people. In the opposite and not the opposite, but in Christ's situation, there was no sin. So he goes straight to being the sacrifice for the people. Have a wonderful day. God bless, and keep walking the walk.